Hello, I'm Hope Wilder at Pathfinder Community School in Durham, North Carolina, and I'm here with Dr. Kevin Currie-Knight from East Carolina University's Department of Education. And we're here to talk to you tonight about self-directed learning and how it looks. Any questions that you have about self-directed learning, you can put into the chat box at the bottom. So Kevin, I want to give you a chance to just say hello.
Hey everyone, how's it going?
All right, and we're going to start out with a brief slideshow presentation that will tell the story of how an education professor discovered self-directed learning. And I'm going to say a few words about Pathfinder and the other people who we hope are out there tonight from the Agile Learning Centers Network. All right, so now I'm just going to go on over into my screen share. Things are going to get a little weird for a minute, and then we'll have our slide share going. All right, so Pathfinder is a self-directed learning community in Durham, North Carolina. We currently have 22 self-directed learners who are registered homeschoolers ages 5 to 14. You can find out more about us on our website, which is pathfindercommunityschool.com or pathfinderdurham.com. And be sure to check out our other videos in this channel while you're here. We have a bunch of Q&A topics. Just browse and enjoy. I wanted to give a big shout out to our ALC network friends for joining us. So we've got Atlas Agile Learning Center, Heartwood ALC, the Thrive Hive in Florida, Zigzag in Asheville, North Carolina. We're in Durham, and then Gastonia Freedom School in Gastonia, North Carolina. So thanks you guys for helping out. To give you a brief overview of where we are in the self-directed education world, Pathfinder is a democratic school that practices self-directed education. So we're similar to democratic schools like, most famously, Summerhill has been around for about 100 years. Albany Free School and Sudbury Valley School were founded around the same time in the late 60s. And the democratic free schools are where kids have a voice in the governance process and they get to determine how the rules of the school are made and pretty much everything about how we run the operations. Then the self-directed education part, we have a big overlap. Self-directed education includes unschooling, so schooling at home in a self-directed way. Then there are also Agile Learning Centers, which are self-directed education and community. And here in the middle is Pathfinder, democratic, and Sudbury schools, kind of between self-directed education and democratic schooling. So hopefully you know a little bit. If you're here tonight, you have some questions about how self-directed education looks. And we've got on our board Dr. Currie-Knight, who is inside the ivory tower, and he's here to tell you how he found out about self-directed learning and why he believes in it. So thanks. I'm going to pass it over to you, Kevin.
Great. Cool. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Cool. Okay. So I'm a professor in a college of education, teaching assistant professor, and used to be a high school teacher. So, even in the early 2000s, I was a pretty traditional kind of teacher. And even as a college professor, I started being a pretty traditional college professor. So I just wanted to go over a little bit of kind of what brought me into self-directed education before we start launching into questions and stuff like that. So, the first question is, what does learning look like? And for most people, when they think about what learning looks like, they kind of close their eyes and they see like kids at desks. And that's kind of what I thought too. It's just that's learning is what you do in school. That's kind of just the assumption that we make. And, that shapes our attitudes about what learning is. I never thought of learning like this way, which these are two pictures actually from Pathfinder. I never thought of learning as something that, first of all, maybe didn't have to involve a teacher in the traditional sense. Never really thought of learning as something that you do without a curriculum, stuff like that. So what was it that got me, thinking, getting away from this view on the left and kind of going a little bit more towards this view on the right? Well, there's a few things. So I was reading some books and preparing for classes that I was going to teach, ironically enough. And I came across two books that were really influential. The first was a book by James Paul G. He's a linguist and concerned with education, called What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy. And his book isn't like anti-formal schooling, but what he noticed was that his son was starting to play video games, and like these video games are pretty incredible learning devices, because that's kind of what a video game is. You have to learn and learn and learn to kind of beat the game. But he was hooked on it. And Dr. G started thinking, well, I know a lot about education, and it seems like these video game designers have stumbled across this way to get kids like really, really motivated to learn in ways that schools want to do. The more I read the book, the more I started looking at people playing video games and doing other things that look like games, maybe not video games. And I started making a list like the one you see here. What do games have that make them so engaging and make kids willing to kind of learn through games versus what do schools have? And I came up with this really different list. And I started really thinking, wow, games and other things that we learn informally really don't have that much in common with the way school is structured. The second book that got me thinking about self-directed education was another book I was using to prepare for a class called The Book of Learning and Forgetting. It's by another linguist named Frank Smith. And in one of his chapters, it's called Fabricating a Theory of Learning. He kind of talks about how we kind of made up this theory of learning around school. And he basically kind of puts it like this, that basically we wanted a science of learning. But in order to have a science, you need observable stuff. And in order to have observable stuff, you need to kind of make the learning very controlled and contrived. And his theory is that we've created this theory about learning that was really just driven by the need to make it look like a science. And in order to do that, we did a whole lot of stuff that doesn't really reflect informal learning. So I just started thinking about it, and all of a sudden, thinking about all this stuff and the difference between the kind of learning we do outside of school and what we do inside of school, and thinking, wow, these two things really are not very common. So I went down what you could probably call the research rabbit hole. For about a year or more, I started reading books about how people learn in informal settings, whether it's how do people learn math without math classes? How do people learn to read without school? How do people learn when they're just in informal groups? Stuff like that. And the more I read, the more I just got really convinced that there's school learning and then there's the rest of learning, and school learning is very artificial. So I guess the answer to the question, like, what does learning look like, is like, it depends. If you're talking about school learning, that's a very different thing than if you're talking about learning with people kind of engaging in informal activities. So to kind of conclude, here's some of the conclusions that I made from my kind of study of this literature. So formal learning is all the stuff on the left. Informal learning is all the stuff on the right side. So some of the differences are, formal learning. I think I had some of the columns mixed up here. So formal learning is always externally chosen. I should have put that in a different column. Informal learning is self-chosen. Informal learning is driven by a desire to know stuff, and formal learning is driven by extrinsic rewards. Informal learning is stuff it kind of varies in length. Like if you think of formal learning, school learning, we learn in like 45-minute increments, and nobody actually does that in real life. Like you don't say, well, I'm going to practice guitar, but only for 45 minutes, and then I'm going to go on and do something else. It's not uncommon for people to practice guitar for 3 hours at a time, whereas in school, it's really, really regimented. So, one of the other differences is that informal learning, like curricular learning, treats learning as this very linear process. You need to know the first step to get to the second step. You need to know the second step to get to the third step. And informal learning, if you really look at how it works, it's not necessarily like that. It's not very neat and tidy. Sometimes you could, get to like a step 3 and realize, oh, wait, I can't get to step 4 until I know step 1, and then go back, learn step 1, and then go back to step 4. Last but not least, it's informal learning is basically what I would call feast and then famine. You learn something and you're hyper absorbed in it for days, weeks. And then you drop it and go on to something else. And then you're into it for days or weeks, and then you drop that. Whereas school learning has this bizarre idea that a school day needs to be divided into, you need to be doing English, then math, then music, then this, then that. Whereas, informal learning is just not uncommon for someone to do something the entire day and then get tired of it. And then the next day they go on to something else. So really the difference is, informal learning really deals with this very unstructured situation. You can kind of develop your own structure, and formal learning is, it's not driven by the person's need. It's driven by tests and stuff like that. So those are kind of the conclusions I came to. And the more I got sold on this idea, the more I figured the informal learning stuff is way more effective than formal learning. So it got me kind of thinking and stuff like that. So I'm going to stop my screen share. And that's the end of my presentation. I went really fast deliberately because I want to save a lot of time. So if you want me to clarify any points or anything like that, I'd be happy to do it. But otherwise, we should probably just open it up.
All right. So thanks, Kevin. And I've got the chat box open for any questions. So I'd like to start out, since you are a professor at college, what are you seeing in college students who come from traditional schooling backgrounds versus any other kinds of educational backgrounds? And how do you think that self-directed education would benefit or be detrimental, whichever way, to somebody going into college? We get a lot of questions from parents about the transition into college from self-directed education.
Well, college is kind of like traditional school in some ways and unlike traditional school in other ways. So I'll talk about, first of all, the ways that college is actually kind of like traditional school, for better or worse. Maybe I would say probably for worse. College is still pretty structured. We still tell students exactly what we want. We give them assignments and say, here's the rubric and here's what you're supposed to turn in. And here's how the assignment is supposed to look and stuff like that. And so Hope knows that in my college classrooms, based on the research I've done, I've gone on to a more self-directed model in my classrooms. So students choose their own projects. They even grade their own projects with kind of my input. And one of the things that I find with students kind of overall, because I don't see a lot of students come in with more self-directed background, it's usually more traditional academics. One of the difficulties I see whenever I back up and don't give students kind of a direct assignment, students struggle with that. They're very used to, tell me what I need to do, tell me what I need to know, tell me how I need to demonstrate on a test. And it's not their fault. It's the system that they went through for K plus 12 years, kind of set them up for that. So it makes my job harder in some ways because they're used to that sort of structure. I've had students show up to my office in various levels of distress because they wanted to know what I wanted from an assignment. Like, what is it that you're looking for? And whenever I throw the question back, well, what is it that you want to write? Or what is it that you want to do? It's a hard question for them. And again, it's not their fault. It's no one's ever asked. But I guess college is also different in some ways because even though there's the same structure of a school somewhat, people are on their own a lot more to manage their time and stuff like that. And it's not uncommon to hear stories about people, especially in their first year or two of college, just not really feeling like they can manage their time very well. And then, of course, our solution is to give them classes on time management, which in some ways compounds the problem because all you're doing is giving them another class instead of kind of letting them experience time management, stuff like that. So I hope that answers the question. But that's kind of, what I've seen, especially as someone who does more self-directed stuff in a college classroom.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. So another question, probably the most frequently asked question that we get is about the basics. So how will my child learn the basics? I was really interested to hear you reference a book about math outside the classroom. So I guess particularly math, can you talk more about that, how you see kids developing skills in kind of mathematical thinking in a less schooled way, something like that?
So the book I referred to is, if I remember the title correctly, it was Street Mathematics and School Mathematics. think Jeffrey Sachs was one of the co-authors to that. So there's actually several studies that the studies that book is based on are about kids who learned math by being basically, I guess you would say, like street vendors in Brazil. And the idea is that these are kids who generally didn't go to school, mostly because they couldn't really afford to go to school. Like they had to work basically, and they learned math through the act of handling money and knowing that they had to make profit. So the idea is they got really good at figuring out like how to make profit, how to give correct change. And it's not like they sat down with a book and said, I want to figure out how these coins work. Often they would apprentice with somebody. They would follow an older kid around who is already a street vendor, and they would kind of watch what they were doing, and they would kind of see what happened. And then maybe they would try it out and they would realize, wait a minute, I lost money. What did I do wrong? So they have a self-interest to figure out, like, how did I lose money? So the pro of those studies is that kids can learn math in a lot of ways, like just doing street vending. I guess if there's a downside to those studies is one of the benefits of formal math learning, like learning math in the paper pencil sense, is that you get better at learning math that can translate from situation to situation. So the street vendors, what they found is one of their downsides was that they couldn't translate the math they knew in street vending to other situations. But in this day and age, it's actually just really much more common to be able to learn formal mathematics. There's so many places you can do it. I guess most people have a question about, like, well, when is my kid ever going to experience math in a way where they want to know how to do it? And I guess my answer to that is I usually have that person kind of think with me, let's think of a list of all the ways we use math in our daily lives, meaning the person who's in front of me and me. Let's just write down a list. So we use math when we're looking at prices. We use math when we're measuring something. We use math when we're cooking. We use math when, and we usually come up with a good list of a lot of things. And then what I say to them is, like, what do you think the likelihood is that your kid will get very far without stumbling across one of these things? And of course, the answer is not they're not going to get very far at all. Like, at some point they will cook, or at some point they will measure things and they need to calculate measurement. And in this day and age, in the information age, it's a lot easier to say, okay, I need to know that math. Let me find a resource to help me with that, whether it's online or another person or something like that. But I guess the only other thing I should say in terms of that is people often kind of want it both ways. So number one, they say this subject is so important that every kid needs to know this subject, math, let's say. But then on the other hand, they say, but this subject is so unimportant that kids, if left to their own devices, would never stumble across this subject. And I want to say, like, it's got to be one or the other. If you think it's a really important subject and you really think that, then your kid's probably going to stumble on it at some point. If you don't really think it's an important subject and you think your kid might never stumble across it, you should ask yourself how important it actually is. Because if you can, make it that many years without stumbling across something, maybe it's not something everyone would need to know anyway. I know that scares a lot of people, but think about all the things that you learned in school that everyone told you are just vitally important, and you will never, this is key to your success in life, that you have forgotten, but yet you still managed to live a decent life.
I don't know what you're talking about, Kevin. I remember everything that I was ever taught. I have an encyclopedic knowledge right here.
I had a conversation with someone at one point about self-directed education. She had that same question, and she's a PhD at my university. She's a colleague. And she said, well, what about like something like history? Like, because, I always feel like I never really learned a lot of history when I was growing up. And I had 2 points. And I said, well, number one, you did learn history because you went to school. You just forgot it, like a lot of us did. But number two, you're a PhD in a department at a well-paying university. You're doing pretty well for yourself. I don't think the gaps in your historical knowledge have really negatively affected you. And I know it's scary for people to hear stuff like that, but at the same time, I don't know if it's realistic to think that we all need to know all the stuff. If it's important, we'll stumble across it.
Cool. Thanks, Kevin. That kind of helped. That covered the question of exposure, which is another very frequent question that I get a lot, and I know a lot of people do in self-directed learning. So I have one from Hanny. Hi, Hanny. About the discipline of working hard through something. So what about instead of I don't really have to do that, kind of giving up too soon if you're growing up with self-direction? And he says, in other words, how do you learn quote unquote grit? So how would you answer that, Kevin?
Yeah, I have a lot to say about grit because I'm in a college of education, and that's currently a really big thing. The first thing I'll say about grit, let's get clear on what grit is, because a lot of people. So Angela Duckworth created this idea. For those who don't know what grit is, Angela Duckworth is a researcher, I think at Penn. She's either at Penn or Yale, and she came up with this idea of like the power of perseverance. And her studies indicate that the ability to persevere through challenges is actually more effective in terms of predicting success than even things like IQ. But the problem is that people look at the perseverance part and realize that Angela Duckworth had two parts to this equation: passion plus perseverance equals grit. Most people focus on the perseverance part, but the important thing is the word passion is in that equation for a reason. Perseverance through challenge without any passion is I mean, that could be a good skill, but what Duckworth had in mind is passion plus perseverance. So I guess the first thing I'd say is we have to be really careful about thinking that we're going to teach grit by just kind of forcing people through the perseverance process, regardless of whether they're passionate. And that's an easy mistake to make. A lot of folks teach grit as simply the perseverance part. But first of all, I know that at least in my studies about how self-direction works, and I think we can all think about instances in our own experience. If we're really, really passionate about a particular thing, we are willing to face a lot of challenges. In fact, James G. talks about this in his book, What Video Games Can Teach Us About Learning and Literacy. One of the things he was really intrigued by with video games is he would see kids who would give up completely on academic subjects in school, go home and play video games where the sequence is try, fail harder, try again, fail more. And they would keep going for hours. And somehow the failure didn't bother them too much. So he was really intrigued by that. And, when I thought about it, part of the reason I think is because video games are this voluntary thing that you only pick up if you're passionate about it. People do give up on video games, but often those are the people who just weren't passionate about video games anyway. I guess the last thing I'll say about kind of the perseverance thing, we have to think about why people aren't persevering. So in school, it's pretty common to see people not persevere very much. Challenge is not something people want to face in school. It's often we grow up with what's called a fixed mindset in school rather than a growth mindset. We see challenge as kind of a fatal thing. But that kind of makes sense if you think about the fact that failure in school is penalized. You grade things, and if you fail on something in school, you're generally penalized for it. So it's no wonder that something like that would be common in school. So usually if you find that you take the grade threat away, you take the threat of failure away, the threat that you have something to lose if you fail, you'll just find people become more perseverant pretty naturally, almost. So I think part of it is also just the threat of failure that school often provides. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, that does make sense. I like what you said about the passion. You can't take the passion away from the grit.
It's
And then
really
also
tricky. A lot of people, when they teach grit and when they talk to K-12 teacher educators about grit, it's the perseverance part they talk about. But passion was an equal part of that equation, and I think that was for a reason.
Right. So I've got another question, which is sort of a longer one, but I think you'll get the picture painted. It's from Sandra. Hi, Sandra. The question is, if we choose self-directed learning, knowing that learning is not linear and that kids will learn, say, reading on their own, but later on, if you find yourself having to go back to traditional schooling, how do I help my child catch up to meet their school standards? Is it going to be a huge learning curve for my kid? Disclosure, we just started this year. My child is about 6 years old. So, Dr. Currie-Knight, I'll try to keep calling you that. How would you answer? How do you catch up and transition to traditional schooling?
I'm tempted to throw this back to you, Hope, because I know you have a story from a former student, and I could tell it.
You were
I know
there.
the
You were
story.
there, so you tell
I
it.
was
But
there.
I could fill in more background
You,
about
you
her.
tell it
Yeah.
better than I do, anyway.
Oh, okay. You guys can tell we know each other. So I actually have been teaching in self-directed circles for about 14 years. I've been an outdoor educator, and I know a lot of young people who grew up unschooling. So I have a young friend whose name is Alice, and now she's in her early to mid 20s. She's out of college. Anyway, she didn't go to school until she was 16. She learned to read on her own when she was maybe 5 or 6, and she literally played in the woods until she was 16. Like, I was there. She played in the woods and talked to her friends the entire time she would have been in school. Then, when she was 16, she really wanted to learn biology, and she read like thrift store books and stuff like that, and she couldn't find what she needed in just picking up books on her own. So she went to her parents and she was like, I really want to go to school because I want to do biology lab. I want to do chemistry. I think this is what I want to do with my life. And they were like, okay. So she went to high school, just normal, straight up public school. Um, and the first day she said, the thing that was the hardest for her was keeping her legs crossed, and that it made a little red bump on her leg, and she was worried that there was something wrong with her leg because she wasn't used to sitting down for 8 hours a day. um, so that was the difficult thing about going back to school. And then that she did have challenges learning things like she had no idea what the American Revolution was. Um, and in history class, she was embarrassed, but she kept quiet. She didn't speak up and let everybody know because she was embarrassed. She didn't know about it. She went home and immediately read everything she could find out about the American Revolution, and very quickly she was up to standard in like everything. So she did really well in the traditional setting, and she said it took almost no time to catch up academically. And from her perspective, I mean, I have video or audio or something of her talking about it herself.
We have it on the Pathfinder YouTube.
Oh, thanks for the plug. It's on the Pathfinder YouTube channel, Grown Unschoolers Forum. You can look on the sidebar thing. Um, so anyway, I don't know that that would be true for everyone, but when I recently spoke to her, she went to college. She was very successful. She's working at the EPA right now, and she's going on to pursue either a master's or doctorate in molecular biology. So it's like I guess my point is that she waited to go to school until she had something she really wanted to learn, and she couldn't learn it another way. And then what she said was that school was just another game. And once she figured it out fairly quickly, like how to play the school game. And she was like, it's so much easier to learn things when people tell you exactly what you need to know to pass the test, versus the way she had been learning in life was just in every direction all the time. And she was like, wow, these people are basically spoon feeding it to me, and everybody thinks I'm so smart for catching up, but really this is so much easier than tracking things down by yourself. The other thing that she said recently, I gathered with a bunch of grown unschoolers and homeschoolers who are in this community who I've known since they were young children. And a bunch of them were talking about how they had done the overachiever thing and gone through college specifically to prove people wrong who said they couldn't do it. Um, and at the same time, a lot of them were speaking with kind of regret about how good they got at the game of college. And then when they got out, it was like they didn't need all those things, or I've just heard them talking about things like, I wish I had spent more time with my friends when I was in college rather than studying so hard for the tests. Now that I'm out of college, I found that, you know, the friendships are more important. So I guess I'm just talking about kind of a more nuanced view of trusting that your child will find the way to meet their needs and reflect their deeper values, um, and be successful in the traditional, whether it's in a traditional schooling sense or um, by finding a meaningful profession, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and
So,
another thing that story tells is the flip side is not only what happened to Alice, but what it says about the school environment she was in. It took her a very little amount of time to catch up to where all the other students were after they had spent years. And we know from a fair amount of research, it's not uncontroversial research, but there's a fair amount of it out there that basically says that if you test kids after they graduate a class or after they promote to the next grade, it only takes a fairly short time for them to forget a pretty large amount of what they learned in class. And I think we've all had this experience. And as a college teacher, I've seen it so many times where someone will say, you know, I'm trying to think of this thing, and I know I learned it last year, but I totally forgot it. You know, it's pretty common to lose the things that you learn. We teach so much in school, and then by the time we move to the next grade, we forget a lot of it. So even if your child goes into a regular school and they have gaps in their knowledge, not only is it usually not going to take them long to figure out how to learn it because that's what they've been learning in a self-directed environment, but their peers who have been in school have probably forgotten a lot of what they learned in an earlier grade anyway. So I just don't think that kids from self-directed learning environments going to school are going to be too far behind. The last story I want to tell about that is there's a book about a self-directed learning school called A School of Our Own, and the school is called the Independent Project. It's in Massachusetts. And they created this as like a semester-long thing where you basically direct your own learning without a curriculum, without a formal curriculum. And one of the problems that the founder of the school, Sam Levin, who's a co-author of the book, had when he was designing the school is, well, these kids are going to go back. It's only a semester program. They're going to go back into a 10th grade or 11th grade classroom. How are they going to do with that transition after not having a curriculum for a semester? What's going to happen? Are they going to be behind? And at least in the book, he reports that basically to a person, everyone did better once they got back into a traditional curriculum. Everyone did better than they had before. Their grades got better than their grades were before. And the reason I think he hypothesizes in the book, and I think he's correct, is the reason is really because when you get really good at learning on your own, you can fill in those gaps. You're not powerless like you maybe were if you didn't really have that familiarity with how to direct your own learning. So yeah, I don't think you should worry too much. I understand why people worry about that, but I really think it's a bigger problem, or it's a lesser problem than we make it out to be.
awesome. Thanks, Kevin. So keep the questions coming. And I'm going to move on to my list of frequently asked questions. So I wanted to ask you, especially because you're in the College of Education, kind of the belly of the beast, training new teachers and the traditional methods. Can you speak a little bit about how to trust if children are learning if they're not being tested, and just kind of what do you see about? I feel like we have a challenge in the self-directed education community that we're constantly trying to prove that the kids are learning. And so I guess I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how to measure progress, not by testing, and also just how would you answer that question in a more general way for a more general audience? Does that make sense?
It does. It's really hard to measure learning without tests. I won't sugarcoat that. It's really hard. And part of the problem with tests, like the Alice situation illustrates, is it's way easier to learn when someone tells you exactly what you need to know and how you need to know it. It's way easier. It's way harder when it's just, okay, learn, progress, monitor it. So this is something that I actually started thinking about with when I was reading the James Paul G book, the video game book, and stuff like that. And I started thinking about, like, how do people monitor their progress when they're learning stuff in absence of tests? Because tests are artificial. Tests are something you almost only do in school. There's not many situations where you learn and with a test. So I started thinking about, okay, so video games are pretty obvious. You monitor your progress based on how far you get in the game. And it's not a test, it's an activity, it's just an activity. But there's a lot of things that are like that. So, another thing I think about is, okay, so think about the person who's learning skateboarding. How do they monitor their progress? And if you ask skateboarders the question, they'll kind of look at you funny. Like, what do you mean, how do I monitor my progress? I monitor my progress when I can do the trick that I couldn't do. That's how I monitor my progress. Like, it's not even an issue. You don't even think about monitoring your progress. But a lot of things are like that. If you're learning to garden, you monitor your progress by figuring out, did your plants grow better this time than they did last time? I guess that's my way of saying that for almost every activity, I don't think every activity has this, but most activities do. There's some quote unquote assessment, to use education language for test. There's some way to monitor progress that's like built into that activity. For cooking, it's I'm going to put a whole bunch of stuff together, put it in the oven, and see if it rose, and see if it tastes good. And yeah, right. But really, for most activities in general, there's some assessment method that is just built into that activity. And then for other things, like maybe you're doing paper and pencil math, and you want to figure out, are you doing it right? There's not always an obvious, thing that's built into that. But I would say that, if you're driven to learn something and you want to get better at it, you'll find an assessment method. Even if you're doing paper and pencil math, let's say you want to get really good at some sort of equation in paper and pencil math. Well, if you're driven to get better and there's no obvious method of assessment, you'll get creative. You'll look online, you'll do the problem on paper and then put it in the calculator and see if it came out right. If you want to get better at writing, you'll give it to people who are better writers than you and say, here, tell me what's wrong. What do you think? So yeah, but in most activities, if you really think about the activity and how people monitor their progress, there should be some obvious built-in assessment method, like, did the parts fit? Did the cake rise? Did my plants die? Stuff like that. I guess the last thing I'll say about that, because I do run a class that's really self-directed at the college level, and one of the things that I've recently done this past year is I've decided I'm not going to grade student projects. Students will grade their own projects. They'll write a report that tells me, what did I learn? What went well about the project? What didn't go well about the project? And here's my grade. And when I first started doing this, my fear was that people won't be able to monitor their progress and they won't be motivated. And it turns out that neither of those were true. They're more motivated, actually, when they don't have a grade, because they are motivated by picking a project they're interested in. And they do monitor their progress pretty well. Sometimes I have to kind of ask them questions for them to figure out that, oh, maybe I'm not progressing as much as I want. But most of the time, they're pretty circumspect about it. Most of the time in their reports, they say, and I feel like I learned a lot about this. And the reason I say that is because I know this and I didn't know it before, or I've gotten this information and it aligned with what I've learned elsewhere. Or people say, I didn't feel like I made a lot of progress because I think I got wrong information from this website. And the reason is because when I checked other websites, it didn't align well. So then I did more research. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that most of the time assessment is kind of built into the activity. You just have to figure out where it's built in and then kind of exploit that.
Well, Kevin, I love your long-winded explanation, so no need to apologize. And I guess just to follow up on what you're saying is that I think as adults we forget how it feels to be evaluated and to be scrutinized when you're doing something that you're not sure of. And I guess as adults, we're not often in that situation where, for example, your boss is sitting behind you while you're typing on the computer doing an important project that's stressful, and I think we forget that there's an observer effect, that maybe there's even more progress when you're not being evaluated. It might just be in a different direction than than a neatly planned path that's laid out in front of you. That's just my thought. So I had another question. I've heard you talk about this before, and I just would like to hear a few words about what you feel like are the benefits of social learning versus kind of individual learning in a more strict classroom setting where you're not allowed to talk to each other and that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so one of the difficult misunderstandings some people who are new to self-directed education will often have is they'll get an idea that is very isolated because it's self-directed. The word self is kind of in there, so it seems like it's a really individual thing. But it's only that the self is directing. That doesn't mean that you're learning alone. Yeah, I mean, I think that social learning is really beneficial at a place like, like Agile Learning Communities or Pathfinder, Sudbury schools, things like that. And part of the reason is that people exchange a lot of information, and not just audibly, not just auditorily. It's not like I just exchange information with you by language. I exchange information with other people by watching what they do and by seeing what they do. And there's actually in child psychology, it's just a well-worn fact that kids learn a ton just by watching other people, just by being around people and watching what they do. I always think about my experience. I'm sure others have had an experience like it. You go to a restaurant that's maybe fancier than you're used to, and there's stuff on the menu you're not sure how to eat. So you look at other people, you watch how they're eating it, and then you pick it up because it's okay. I saw them do it this way. I'll do it this way. And kids are like that too. They share a ton of information. And so in a regular classroom, in a traditional classroom, teachers makes an effort to make it social. Kids aren't always sitting at desks in classrooms. They're up and about, but it's really still teacher directed in the end. If you think about a regular classroom, it's what I like to call a bottleneck situation. Everything bottlenecks through the teacher. The teacher tells you when you're going to socialize. The teacher tells you when you're going to do your lab. The teacher tells you when you give an answer. You raise your hand and wait for the teacher to call on you. Whereas at a place like an ALC or Pathfinder or something like that, if you want to figure something out, you ask people or you watch people, or it's not bottlenecked. You don't have to go to a teacher and wait for the teacher to get to attend to you. It's kind of a more dispersed situation. If someone has information that I want, I can just go straight to them. Whereas if I were in a classroom, I would have to go to the teacher, and the teacher would say, okay, you can talk to them. Yeah, so there's definitely a benefit to social learning. And of course, social learning doesn't necessarily mean face-to-face social learning either. I mean, it probably used to, but in kind of our hyper-connected information age, we are also connected in virtual spaces. So it's quite often the case that people can learn socially by going to YouTube or another video site and looking for videos on a particular thing. In fact, my students in my self-directed iteration of the class I teach, they are always getting information online. A lot of them create classroom management plans by going to Pinterest because there's a lot of stuff, pictures of management plans on Pinterest and stuff like that. So it's there's a lot more information that can flow between sources than can bottleneck to a teacher.
Cool. All right. There's another question we're working on. I'm not quite sure I understand the question, so I'm going to hold on it for a second. If you had 5-ish minutes to talk about screen time and just what your thoughts are on screen time. I know it's always a very hot topic in the self-directed education community and outside of it too. And I guess my more general question is sort of about the question of self-control and whether or not kids can learn self-control when they're exposed to things like sugar or screens or activities that might be harmful to them in some way. So I guess I'm less interested in whether you think screens are harmful and more interested in the self-control kind of angle. If you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, so I've looked at some of the research, like some of the academic studies that have been done on effects of screen time, and the long and the short of the matter, at least from what I read, and I'm trying to read the data as fairly as possible, we have no idea what the effect of screens is going to be. Some studies say that the effect is either benign or good. Other studies say that the effects are bad. The problem is we don't have a large enough time horizon yet to know what's really going to happen. What I can tell you is that decades and decades and decades, really every generation has had some sort of moral panic over the technology of the day, the technology of the age. For my generation, Gen X, TV was surely going to kill us. We were going to be unsocial. We were going to be really stupid. We weren't going to be able to focus on anything because TV is so entrancing. I don't think a lot of that came to pass. I think ADHD was on the rise, but I think there was a combination of factors that explain that. But then I was talking to psychologist Peter Gray, who we had out at Pathfinder for an event last summer, and he disagreed with me. He said, Kevin, you're reading the data wrong. And he said, the data actually doesn't show any bad effects at all. And I trust that he's done a deeper read of the data than I have. He's written several really well-documented blog posts and I think articles about this, where he goes into the studies that show that there's bad effects of screen time. He kind of goes through and says these studies were either really flawed in how they did their study, or people misread their study in the media and kind of exaggerated their claims. I don't know which one is true. I still think that when I read the data, I think it's really ambivalent. I don't think we can tell. But I also want to kind of, remind folks who are concerned about the technology angle, humans have always changed. We've always changed how we worked. So before books came about, let's say, I mean, in terms of evolutionary terms, we've always had short attention spans. In fact, if you think from an evolutionary sense, it would have been a disadvantage to have a long attention span. If there's a noise over in that forest and your attention is so focused on this other thing, you're not gonna pass on your genes. It's so some evolutionary and developmental psychologists have said, the idea that we should have a longer attention span is a relatively new phenomenon. In evolutionary time, it's almost certainly never been that way. And attention spans will change, and they change with the advent of writing, and they change with the advent of TV, and they change with the advent of computers. I don't know how they're going to change in the future, but humans don't sit still in terms of how we are for very long. Our nature changes over time. So those are my thoughts. I know other people have other thoughts on it, but those are mine.
Well, yeah, but we're only interested in your thoughts tonight. So
I just want to be fair because I know
I know.
would strenuously disagree with me on this.
Yeah, it's cool. So I think I've got some clarity on the next question, and I can help out with it. I think I'm gonna answer and broaden a little bit too. So from Sandra, she says, we're working as facilitators not to coerce the child into doing or learning, but to support learning. What are some things I can do at home in terms of learning activities? I often have guilt feelings if I'm not actively involved in learning, LOL. And asking, like, is it okay to involve your child in the planning of activities so they're child-led? And I guess my first, the expansion of this that I see is kind of a concern that a lot of parents have. And it's like, what if my child does nothing? What if my child isn't learning? What if they're just lying around and there's, and I'm not helping them learn, something like that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you? And
yes.
I guess I have a choice book list to help with this question, but I want to hear your thoughts first.
Well, it's interesting because I know in conversation, Hope, we've talked about how if you go into a place like Pathfinder, most people will think it's a self-directed learning place, but what you'll see kids doing is sitting down doing learn activities where the learning is obvious. But what you really see is a lot of doing, and the learning is kind of secondary. People don't go in to say, what am I going to learn today? They go in to say, what am I going to do today? My advice would be, like, ever since I've started to think about the difference between informal and formal learning, one of the big differences is that formal learning has in some ways taught us to think of learning as a goal rather than a byproduct. So I have a 2-year-old son, to illustrate the point. We don't spend a lot of time concerned with learning activities with him. We just do stuff and figure that learning will happen. And he's 2.5 right now. And somehow, many weeks ago, we discovered he knows most of his letters. If you point to a letter, he knows what it is. We didn't teach him this at all. Like, we have some kind of videos. Some of them are like alphabet videos and stuff on his tablet. But we don't kind of go into it with the goal of learning. He watches what he wants to watch. We don't say, oh my gosh, he's not watching his alphabet videos. So he'll watch stuff and he'll pick stuff up. And he knows a lot of phrases and words that we've never taught him. He's starting to put those things together. And I guess what I'd say is try not to approach it with learning as the goal. Learning is a byproduct. So think of it this way. We learn in order to do new stuff. So we do stuff, and then learning is basically acquiring the skills to be able to do the stuff. So if you do stuff, the learning will follow when people realize they need more skills to expand their practice. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just I feel like in a lot of ways we think of learning as this thing that we have to plan. And if I don't know what they're learning at any given time, they must not be learning. And it's almost certainly not the case. They're learning stuff. It's just that maybe they don't know what they've learned yet, and maybe you don't know what they've learned yet. But like our 2.5-year-old, when we realized that he knows his letters and nobody actually really taught him those letters, we realized, oh, that's what he's been doing. Okay.
Cool. And I have a thought to add, which is so something that I really admire about the Reggio Emilia model is that they see the teachers as just observers rather even than facilitators. And so I would say, Sandra, if you're feeling concerned about your child's learning, something you could do after school when they get home is to write down what you see them learning. So, and that's, if you write down what you see them learning, what you see them working on, you can actually track, you can make it visible to yourself. Because I think what Kevin is saying is that a lot of times we don't see children learning, I think, in a way because we're not paying attention to the kinds of things that they're doing, like things like, I'm thinking about things like tying your shoes, or kids ask me all the time things like how to use the microwave, small things, how to flip a little bottle up. And I see kids going from tentativeness to full mastery within a short amount of time with these kind of life skill type things. And I guess I would also say I've been reading a lot of Becky Bailey, who's a child psychologist, and she recommends if you're not doing homework with your kids, just spend time connecting with them. And that basically, as a parent, your relationship with your child is the most valuable thing that you can give them. Your attention is the most valuable thing that you can give them. And what they'll be learning is that you really care about them, and that you love them and you trust them. And so I think that is probably the greatest gift that any parent can give a child, is the feeling of really being seen and being noticed, and appreciated for the things that they're interested in and the things that really stir a spark inside of them. So that's how I would answer that question. So Kevin, we've got just about 5 more minutes, and I don't have any particular questions, but do you have? I guess I'm curious to hear, because I know you're teaming up to do some research into self-directed education. If you can just give a little broad overview of what the research into self-directed education is like, and maybe a little teaser about what you're up to.
Sure. So I'm working on one study with some folks who are involved in self-directed education and some folks who are not involved in self-directed education. We are trying to get into middle and high school classrooms in some various cities and trying with an eye towards asking students via surveys and interviews what their learning looks like outside of school. So when you're learning stuff that you just do on your own, like whether it's skateboarding, or I'm learning a language because I want to, or I'm learning about anime or whatever it is, kind of with the tentative hypothesis that all of the things that we find out will be very different from what school learning looks like. So we're asking them questions like, how long in one sitting can you spend learning whatever it is you're learning? And when we ask people, when I've asked people informally, it's not uncommon for them to say, oh, like 3 hours. Whereas in school, it's like you watch them in school and they're like, it's hard for them to concentrate for 20 minutes. Or we'll ask them questions like, what motivates you to do this? And of course, when they're outside of school, grades are not the motivator. But when they're inside of school, grades are almost always the motivator. It's a very different thing. So we're trying to get an idea for how learning looks when you're outside of school versus inside of school by talking to teens. Another study that I've just recently been asked to join is a study with psychologist Peter Gray, Gina Riley, who's another psychologist, and some others. And we're looking at, we are going to ask via surveys some alumni of a particular Sudbury model school. We're going to ask them kind of their experience once they graduate. We're talking about graduates. What has your experience been like? So when you look back on your education, do you feel like it was good? Do you feel like there are gaps that you could have gotten into traditional school? Do you regret going this route rather than a traditional school? And how did you find jobs? Did you go to post-secondary education, stuff like that? So we're trying to get kind of an eye for like what that transition process looked like, what they're doing now, how they look back on their education, stuff like that. And then I have a tentative book project that I'm starting on, which is basically going to discuss what I think are myths about learning that we basically get because we're used to what it looks like in school. So there's the myth, which is kind of, here's what it looks like in school. And then there's the reality of what learning actually looks like when you take away those school structures. So those are some of the things that I'm working on.
Cool. All right. Well, nice plug. I guess that's about it. We're just a couple minutes short of 8 o'clock, and I wanted to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your time. And please do check out the books. I've been keeping a book list in the chat screen, and I think the chat screen will still be available later. I'll also take that book list and post it on our Facebook page in case you want to do further reading about some of the things that we've been talking about.
Cool.
So people are saying thank you. So thank you, Kevin, also known as Dr. Currie-Knight. And thanks you guys for coming. And now I just want to like do a little dance or something. So
it's always fun.
Yeah, doing a little dance show. If you're one of the facilitators at a learning center, please use this video. Kevin's probably going to go through and put the questions as a
that table of contents below. So if you go to YouTube in the video description, I'll probably create a table of contents link so that if you want to go to a particular question, you can just type on that time frame and it'll just go there.
All right, so you can share it with your friends and share just the question that you're interested in and not the whole hour.
Or you can share the whole video.
Ah, even better. Like us, subscribe us. Now I feel like a YouTuber. All right, thanks everybody, and good night.
Night.